All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the American Watchman Roundtable. I believe this is our fifth episode, if I'm not mistaken. We missed an episode last week because half of us weren't here. We had prior arrangements, so Adam and I actually did a segment on my podcast, the Withhold Report, last week. So if you want to go listen to that after this, feel free to do so. But we're all back this week to talk about Trump's summit in Helsinki with President Vladimir Putin and the news surrounding the Helsinki summit has been, pretty interesting to say the least. I covered it about an hour ago on my own show, The Whitfield Report, and it was so explosive that that it crashed my internet and I had to reboot everything in order to do this podcast. So we'll be talking about Helsinki tonight. But without further ado, I'd like to all my other co-hosts to introduce themselves as per usual, starting with Adam.
Hey guys, I'm Adam. I'm one of the editors and co-founders of American Watchman.
Gabe.
Hey team, I'm Gabe, and I'm one of the co-founders and one of the editors for AW.
So and apparently Gabe has also morphed into a yellow lab this week too. So
that's a perfect picture of him, by the way, because that's the expression he basically gives us whenever we tell him to do anything.
I would note. I would note, Sam, that Gabe is not the first political commentator to use a dog, his pet dog specifically, as his avatar online. I know that John Zimmerak, a columnist with Catholic Vote, does the same thing on Twitter.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've also seen that Dana Perino does that as well. And speaking, of course, is the infamous Joshua Johnson. So, Josh, feel free to introduce yourself.
I'm Joshua Johnson. I'm a co-founder of American Watchman, and I recently discovered that I had a mutual friend on Facebook with the alleged Russian spy that was just arrested. So I'll start off with that breaking news. That was kind of creepy, but I think she's innocent.
Does that mean you're going to get wrapped up in the Mueller investigation, Josh?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that I was too intimately connected. It's just one circle removed. But
well, I mean, you are kind of our pro Russia guy here though. So and let's just jump into it. Obviously, Trump met with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki, Finland, this past week, and lots of things happened. But I guess the big let's just kind of clear the proverbial elephant out of the room. Trump basically said that there was no collusion with Russia during the 2016 election, and the media and the establishment Republicans basically went ape over those remarks. And, we've been seeing endless amounts, or at least it seems like endless amounts, of columns and opinion pieces and tweets calling Trump a traitor. So, first off, I guess I would just kind of open this up Well, yeah, what were you guys' reactions to the Helsinki summit in general, and do you think this summit gives any credence to Mueller's investigation or any of this other Russia-phobia?
I would just start by issuing a minor correction. He didn't just deny that there was collusion. He's always denied that there was collusion between his campaign and the alleged Russian hackers, if there were any.
Right.
What he did that was sort of new, but not entirely unexpected, was say that he agreed with he accepted President Putin's explanation that Russia didn't do it, and disagreed with our intelligence services in so doing.
Yeah. Now I could be lost, but on this one, but what to me that doesn't seem that outrageous considering that RussiaGate is a big nothing burger, and as I said on my own podcast, towards the end of the show, which interestingly enough is when I got cut off. I believe that there are good men and women in the intelligence community, and I also believe that there are, of course, nefarious individuals in the intelligence community. And I believe that those nefarious individuals, this is kind of my Alex Jones moment, so to speak. I believe that the nefarious individuals within the intelligence community are the ones kind of propping up this whole Russia collusion conspiracy. It seems
Well,
it's it seems to me that if they had any evidence, they would have presented it at least 6 months ago.
Well, you're not a part of the political class, so I'm not surprised that you're not really up in arms about it. But it's not so much. I mean, it is what he said that freaked the political class out. But there were two things that he said at that press conference that really outraged the three things, but we'll get to the third one later because it's sort of an aside. But the two major things he did at that press conference that enraged the political class and that is viewed by them as treason in their eyes is first he acknowledged that the current state of Russo-American relations is not just Russia's fault. He said it was the fault of both countries, that America shared some of the blame, and in so doing, he rejected the usual American exceptionalist line that the foreign policy elite in D.C. always like to quote from and treat as though it were holy writ. And by going off of that, he basically, in their eyes, committed treason. The second thing he did was he said that he accepted the explanation of a foreign leader over our own intelligence services, which on the face of it, if you're a normal person, doesn't seem too shocking because our intelligence services have been wrong or flat out caught lying in the past. But to the political class, it was particularly enraging because for them, it's sort of an idol worship kind of thing. The intelligence services are part of the same DC political system establishment swamp, if you will, that they are. And so any self-reflection, any sort of even admission that they might be wrong is akin to them. To them, it's akin to, say, somebody finding the body of Jesus. I mean, it's just blasphemy in their eyes that he could dare challenge the magisterium, if you will, of the political elite, that he could dare challenge their quasi-religious doctrine they all follow.
Which you get, it doesn't really surprise me with the quote unquote establishment conservatives, but it does surprise me that moreover that some of the more liberal as that the more liberal Democrats are, in favor of taking the intelligence communities because after all, they gave Bush a lot of guff for using waterboarding and other techniques, and allowing the CIA to do that.
Here's the thing, though, Sam. Here's the thing. That's all surface complaints, because if you go back and you look at the voting records of those Democrats, Hillary Clinton, for example, harped on how she was against Trump during the 2016 campaign because he dared suggest that we torture terrorists. But she voted for that stuff when Bush was president.
Yeah, yeah.
For the Patriot Act. All the Democrats who complain about these things voted for the Patriot Act. If you look at a lot of these foreign policy issues, the elite members of Congress vote, regardless of party, they vote all together. It's the one thing that they seem to consistently agree on is in foreign policy.
Yeah, why I was actually about ready to bring up that, irony that on the surface, that's what they do. So do you see, I guess I'll open this up to anyone in the panel, but do you think there could be any fallout from the Helsinki summit in terms of negative Do you think this could impact Trump's presidency in a negative way, or do you think this will just fizzle out in the future?
I think it'll fizzle out, honestly. I think there's going to be a bunch of uproar from in the get go, and then eventually it's going to fizzle out as the Democrats frantically try to find something else to bash Trump on.
Gabe?
Yeah, I agree that I think it'll fizzle out. I mean, when you think about how much news is generated by the administration or just generally the going-ons 24/7, I think this will just fizzle out. I mean, because the thing is, most of the news from Helsinki wasn't so much what Trump said, because keep in mind, the day after he said it, he basically walked back his comments and said, no, I believe the intelligence agencies. So, you know, whether what Trump believes or doesn't believe, he's not saying really what he believes. But I am sure in 2 or 3 days something else will take up the news spotlight, and this will kind of be just another story in the news, and we'll forget about it in a week unless Trump continues to push it, which I don't think he will, because he jumps from story to story.
It can't hurt him because, as we sort of mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, if you're not a member of the political class, and you're not somebody who's been deeply affected with Trump derangement syndrome, in which case I don't really care what you think, because I think you're part of the minority even within Democrats anyway, actual Democrat voters, that is, not the crazy activists or the politicians. If you're a normal person outside of the Beltway, you don't really care about what Trump said or didn't say at the Helsinki summit, because you don't profit off of the things that Trump's changing in foreign policy. You don't profit off of the current world order, so you don't care about it too much. It's not going to affect you. You're not. It's not a bread and butter issue. Let's put it that way. For the people on Capitol Hill, it might make Trump's life temporarily a little bit more difficult. But if you look, a lot of the Republican senators that have come out the most hard against him on this are either people that are retiring because they know that their voters aren't with them anymore, or people who, I hate to say it, might not be around too much longer, either due to age or health issues.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think this won't have much of a play, I mean, domestically in terms of elections or generally shifting opinions about Trump one way or the other. I don't think it will have that much of an impact. I think it's being honestly blown out of proportion simply because the Beltway likes to blow things out of proportion.
And the thing is, they're not focusing. I mean, we've not got a whole lot of. We know that verbal agreements were made between Putin and Trump at the summit. We know at least what one of them are concretely right now. But the rest, we're still waiting for either the Russians to say something or for Trump's administration to say something. But it's striking how his comments at the sentiments he expressed at the press conference have completely swallowed the news coverage on this instead of the actual concrete policy that has come out of it.
Well, there has been no concrete policy that's come out of it. That's the thing. Everything
They did reach an agreement. Both the Pentagon and the Russian Ministry of Defense have come out on this. Trump and Putin did reach an agreement on Syria and Israel and the status of Iranian forces within Syria. But
is that a document or is that a verbal agreement?
Verbal agreement, but it's already being implemented on the ground, as I understand it. The Russians are pressuring both Russia and the United States committed themselves to the defense and the security of the state of Israel. And as part of that, the idea is that the Russians are going to pressure the Iranians to get out of Syria. Russian troops will be allowed to remain on the ground in Syria. American troops are going to get out of Syria, and the West is going to have to accept that President Bashar al-Assad is sticking around for a little while. And on Assad's end, the Syrians have signed what's the term I'm looking for? Not a ceasefire, because they weren't at war with Israel, but an agreement not to attack Israel, as they have done in the past.
Oh, okay.
So Josh, you kind of preemptively answered my next question, which was what positive aspects came out of the Helsinki summit. But as I said, you
Well,
guys.
to put it bluntly, this is the closest we've ever been to there being. I know they've had past negotiated ceasefires between the rebels and the government in Syria, but none of those have held. This is the closest we've come, I think, to a definitive end, or at least the beginning of an end, to the Syrian civil war, which has already become impossible for anyone but the Syrian government to win militarily anyway, barring outside intervention, which isn't going to happen. So the most positive aspect is that for the people of Syria, maybe the suffering can stop and they can get back to trying to rebuild their country and live their lives. In Aleppo, they've already got the city back up and running relatively normal. The pictures out of it are just amazing, seeing how it's gone from being a war zone just 2 years ago to what looks like a bustling city again just 2 years later. But that's the most concretely good thing out of it. There are some less concrete positives out of it, which I think is just, as Rand Paul noted, more engagement with Russia, a rapprochement, if you will, and an optimistic view on Russo-American relations going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree with that. I'll agree with Josh's interpretation on that. But also, I mean, one of the positives from my perspective is it doesn't behoove us not to talk to Russia. I mean, I've made this point before. It doesn't behoove the two nations with the most nuclear weapons on the planet to not talk to each other about anything. I mean, going back to like a pre-Cold War stance, regardless of whether anything comes of those conversations, it doesn't benefit anybody not to talk to each other.
I would agree, and I would also say, and I've said this before in the past, it seems to me that Hillary Clinton and the political deep state, and when I mean deep state, I mean the military industrial complex and the establishment members of both political parties, they almost seem to, in my mind at least, they almost seem to want another Cold War with Russia at this point. For what reason they would have? For what reason they would have for that, other than keeping everyone in mass hysteria? I don't know, but that kind of seems to be the way that they're acting. So
in the aftermath, I know I sent it to you guys earlier today in the non-business group. I don't know if you all had a chance to watch it. I know at least Adam probably did. But right after the summit, when he was speaking to some diplomats at a conference with members of the Russian Foreign Ministry, President Putin sort of touched on this. And I think it would be interesting to see if he and Trump actually talked about it. We don't know because it was just them and the interpreters. But if I had to guess, I would think it at least came up in some capacity based on Putin's remarks. But Putin basically came out and he almost singled out the Democrats, but not quite so bluntly. He talked about the powerful forces within the United States political elite that are trying to keep Russia and America at conflict with each other and are trying to damage Russo-American relations. And to your point about why would the political elite, why would the deep state want to keep ruining relations with Russia? There are three reasons, I think, primarily. First, if you look back to when the Russophobia began to sort of heat up again in D.C., it was around 2013, especially after 2014, right after the Olympics. But in 2013, Russia passed their anti-gay propaganda laws, which basically say you cannot have things like gay pride parades or television programs, or anything that openly promotes homosexuality. Contrary to popular opinion in the West, it did not make it illegal to be gay in Russia. You can be gay in Russia, you just can't go around promoting that lifestyle under this law.
But that explains, Josh. I don't know if you had a chance to tune into my show before this, but that explains then why Anderson Cooper was going off on what a tyrant Putin was.
Yeah, that's the thing. Nobody raised this concern prior, especially from the left, until after 2013. So part of it is because Russia has come to openly represent everything culturally. It's part of the culture wars. Everything culturally that our political elites and the deep state are against. If the elites are the secular hedonists, then Russia and a lot of these populist movements across Europe that they all loathe so much represent a return to a more traditional society. So that's the first reason. I'll try to keep the next two brief because I've rambled too long, I feel like. The second two, though, second is, of course, the sale of weapons and arms. It's for companies like Lockheed Martin and for the major defense contractors, it behooves them to constantly be at war with somebody, some other major power. And you might ask, why not China? Well, obviously, because the global elite benefit from the free trade positions that the Chinese have been pushing for years and years and years. They benefit from the trade with China in a way that average Americans don't really seem to get much out of anymore, and in a way that's actually hurt us. So, of course, the only other candidate for who that huge enemy can be then, and one which happens to already align with their cultural biases, is Russia, which is why they choose to, not just for the cultural reasons, but for the economic reasons of keeping their donors and those that keep them in power happy. And the third reason, I would say, has to do with the fact that and this sort of ties into the cultural one again, but Russia doesn't just represent, and the populist parties, cultural differences from what our elite want, but they also represent systemic differences. The so-called liberal democracy that we've seen propped up in Hungary or Poland. It is at the core a power struggle, so to speak. It's a competition between two ideologies. So those are the three reasons they want to have permanent conflict with with Russia, in a way we don't see them wanting to have one with the much more obvious enemy, the Chinese.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo Josh's point on that, but I'll focus sort of on the domestic political side of it. So there always was, and this harkens back to 2008 before, there always was a tension between Obama and Hillary Clinton, and you can see it in the campaign, the primaries in 2008, where Clinton was much more hawkish than Obama. And you saw it in 2012 when Obama campaigned on talking to Russia, and Romney said basically Russia's the worst thing ever, and that they're our worst enemy in the world. And after, I mean, Clinton was kind of silent because she was in Obama's administration for a while, and then she left, and that's really where you sort of saw domestically a shift in the party in terms of generally going along with Obama and having more of this open relations policy. And then Russia invading Ukraine and Crimea and those other issues sort of drove the party elites in the Democratic Party more towards this conflict-prone, sort of tense relations side with Russia. And I think for the most part that has just been momentum that's built within the party that has pushed them towards this position. And especially when you combine that with Trump now being in office, I like to coin it as the phrase, because Trump. Anything Trump does or anything Trump tends to believe, the Democratic Party automatically opposes. And because he wants fairly open relations with Russia, Democratic Party doesn't want it.
Well,
bouncing off Gabe's point, I can also attest during the latter stages of the 2016 election, I was watching a lot of Russia's domestic politics, and the level, and I think we all know here that the people in Russia actually have a higher opinion of Trump than people from other countries, other European countries specifically, do of our president. But during the election, the Russian people themselves absolutely loathed Hillary Clinton. And part of I'll have a little anecdote here in a minute, but part of the reason for that was because when her husband was president, Bill Clinton, he actively pushed to help get Boris Yeltsin elected. There's a Time magazine cover on this, and they did an article on it at the time talking about how the Clinton campaign sent people to go help Yeltsin get into power after the Soviet Union collapsed. And Yeltsin is just utterly hated in Russia as being a foreign puppet and as a man who sold the country out to foreign corporate interests and began empowering these oligarchs that Putin's cracked down on since he took over. So for a lot of average Russians on the Russian domestic end of it, The Clintons are absolutely loathed as the people who made their lives a living hell in the 1990s, along with Boris Yeltsin. There was one old man I remember reading at the time. The story stuck with me. One older gentleman from Russia who was in a rural area of the country, so a little village, didn't have much money. I think they said he maybe only had like $100 to his name in terms of his savings in US dollars. And he wanted to try and somehow give that money to the Trump campaign. He couldn't, of course, but he wanted to give the money to the Trump campaign because he thought Hillary Clinton, I can't remember the exact words, but he essentially said something to the effect of, "That woman's a demon from hell. I don't want her to be in the presidency because she wants to destroy the Russian people." I mean, that's how bad the average Russian hates the Clinton. So it ties in domestically over there as well, I would say.
So the Russians view the Clintons as being almost as bad as the Soviet communists in Russia, from what I've gathered, and you're not the first person to give those anecdotes either, that I've heard. Michael Moros, who is a fairly well-known young conservative activist, like many of us are, his mother is actually originally from Russia, and escaped Soviet communism. I guess from talking with her on Facebook, I've come to find out that, yeah, like you've heard, many Russians do not appreciate the Clintons at all.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. I've heard from a lot of Russians myself. They do compare her a lot to, and for good reason, because a lot of her policies are Soviet-esque almost. But I don't think they would hate her so much because they hate her because of that. But I don't know if they'd bring up the Soviet part. It's a weird relationship with the Soviet Union and Russia. I think Putin said it best when he said, "If you don't want the Soviet Union back, you have no heart. If you do want it back, you have no brain." So I think for some of them, it represents national pride. It was when they were a huge superpower. They still are, but obviously not to the degree they were as the Soviet Union. But at the same time, as Putin noted, if you want it back, you have no brain because the communism just doesn't work. And they experienced that firsthand, and they understand that Hillary Clinton's, even though she's essentially neoliberal, she is still further left economically than Trump or anyone is. And I think not just Russians, but other people that have lived in socialist countries recognize that immediately.
She's also now staked her claim to being anti-Russian in a lot of ways. I mean, she's turned Russia into basically the boogeyman of the world, which is definitely not going to endear her to the Russian people. And I think if it was a choice between the two for the average Russian, between Clinton and Trump, they would take Trump hands down because Trump wouldn't have a knee-jerk reaction to everything they did, which is just to oppose them.
Well, you guys want to. Well, so I mentioned this on my podcast earlier. Again, I was talking a lot about Helsinki. I believe that the entire Russophobia, for me at least, on the domestic side, this whole Russophobia conspiracy all goes back to the 2016 election, and I would like to apply the saying, the simplest explanation usually is the correct one. The reason why Hillary Clinton lost the election wasn't because of Russian collusion. That's been the narrative we've been hearing for the last, 2 years. But the reason why Hillary won the election, and obviously you guys know this, and anyone listening to this podcast knows this, but Hillary is one of the most hated individuals in this country as well. She went so far as to basically rig the primaries of her own party against Bernie Sanders. I believe, and Roger Stone has said this as well, I believe that she attempted to bribe her way into the White House, and that she actually tried to sabotage the election in her favor. And so everything, she had everything rigged according to her favor. And then when she lost, she couldn't process it because she hasn't because she has a narcissist complex. And so because she can't say, well, maybe I'm flawed, she had to blame it on someone else. And, who is easier to blame than America's past enemy, from 50 years before? Many boomers have, fears of the Russians going back to, the days of the Cold War. And so, you know, granted the boomers, make up the majority of her base. I would say that she played that card you know, just to boost hysteria.
I don't even know if it was so much a strategic move. We talked before about how everybody's a prisoner of their own generation. I know Charles Colomb. He's on our side on this issue, but he is a baby boomer. And I remember when Obama was president, and I hope to have him on the show one day because he's a very brilliant man. But he said multiple times when Obama was president that because of his age, he had a hard time. He accepted it, but he had a hard time accepting that the stuff Vladimir Putin often said made more sense than the stuff that Obama was saying in terms of domestic and just general cultural sentiment and things like that. And I think, I think there was certainly some degree of Hillary wanting to make it look like the election was stolen because she has a bit of an ego problem, which is an understatement. But I also think it was also just sort of like Gabe said, it was that knee-jerk reaction partially due to her age or the generation she's in.
Yeah, and Clinton or Hillary has always been more hawkish than the average Democrat. I mean, she was that way under Bill. Obviously, she wasn't in elected office, but she's always been slightly more hawkish than the average Democratic voter. I mean, she sided with Bush on a number of things and a number of votes when she was in the Senate. That if the Democrats didn't have Bush derangement syndrome back then, they would have probably been fairly miffed at her. And to a lesser degree, I think it was under the surface compared to other debates during the 2008 primary. But it did come out that Hillary was more hawkish than the party during that primary.
Yeah, I would say that's true. I would also say going back to the Clinton administration, I mean it's fairly obvious, and this may come off as a joke, but I'm going to try anyway. It's pretty clear that she was the one during the Clinton administration, both literally and metaphorically wearing the pants in that marriage, and and in that presidency, because if you look at her role as first lady, she was always promoting policy as both I wouldn't go so far as to say she was running the country back in the 90s, while Clinton was getting BJ's, but it was certainly interesting that she was promoting policy in the White House, which hadn't really been done prior as a first lady.
It's interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned this, because now that I think about it, Hillary Clinton could very well be, along with her husband, but if we were to believe that he was if he was the puppet boy and she just pulled his strings, Hillary Clinton may well be the single person most responsible for the Russian-American relationship not working out after the Cold War, because her husband was the one who first began violating the promises that Bush II had made to the Soviet leadership on the way out. Was the Eastern Bloc collapsed, which was, we're not going to expand NATO further westward, and Bill immediately began violating that, and then so did Bush and subsequent presidents, perhaps under Hillary's influence, but also just propping Yeltsin up and more or less raping the country for its resources, if you will, and trying to ram our culture down their throats in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. All that mostly under Bill at the beginning. And then again, now that she loses, she whips Russophobia up to hysterical levels to evade the fact that she lost because she was a bad candidate. So Hillary Clinton may well be more responsible than anyone else for the tensions we've had with Russia, not just recently, but going back since the 90s.
So many double entendres with the Clintons about rape and shoving things down people's
That
throats.
wasn't intentional. I was just expressing myself. I wasn't trying to make a pun.
No, I know you were, but I was just saying that even though that wasn't your intention, you know, it worked. Whenever you talk about the Clintons, that metaphor works out perfectly, no matter what your intention is.
Well, think about what Gabe said. You know, Hillary being more hawkish, one of the most hawkish politicians in the American establishment, and then you know, I mean, if you and I are in a have had a long fight, and I deliver the knockout blow to you, and I put you down on the floor, and then I immediately start beating the shit out of you while you're lying on the floor, and I take all your money and everything from you, and I just treat you like crap after I've beaten you. Is it normal for me to then turn around and expect you to treat me magnanimously or want to be my buddy? You know, I mean, just the way that America has behaved as the winner of the Cold War, and this began under Clinton, has not been conducive to making Russia think that we're a good potential friend for them.
You're right. You're right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And for a second there, I also thought you were talking about, you know, Hillary's relationship with Bill, with her beating the crap out of him. So, but okay, I'll stop with the Bill Clinton jokes now. But,
I will say it is amazing as much as Clinton, even in some Democratic circles, is loathed because she lost to Trump. It is amazing how much influence she has been able to exert on her party, though, in terms of Russia.
yeah.
Keep in mind, this is a lady who lost 2 elections. She's more hawkish than the majority of people in her party, yet her views on Russia now are basically the majority view within her party.
I would say she's more hawkish than a lot of conservatives who are pro-military.
Right, exactly.
Which is, you know, that, I mean, originally, you know, Republicans have always been kind of stereotyped as, you know, being very hawkish, very pro-military, and the left, you know, has been very anti-war. But now, I mean, it's almost kind of flipped, you know, the cultural paradigm.
Well, I think to Dave's point, it's not just incredible how much influence she's had on her party's views of Russia, but the reverse also would seem to be true. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but the polls coming out lately about the views average Republican voters have towards Russia, they're all upwards of 70% positive with regard to Trump's performance at Helsinki. I remember right after the election, there were polls that the elite were freaking out because the average Republican was over. I think it was over 50% of the Republican voters held Putin in high esteem right after the election, and now this. So it's interesting to see, as you mentioned, the way both Trump and Clinton have managed to sort of flip both their respective parties on this issue. And I think that speaks sort of towards the general realigning we've seen going on that I keep bringing up.
Well, we're all a bunch of Russian agents, though, Josh. I mean, that's the explanation that the Democrats want us to want.
Here's the funny thing: the treason, as defined in the Constitution, requires that you be actively supporting or helping a country we are at war with, and it has to be witnessed by 2 people. So the loosey-goosey attitude that the Democrats and the establishment Republicans have taken on this treason narrative is incredibly dangerous, I think, because the reason our founders wrote the definition of treason so narrowly in our Constitution is precisely because it had been abused for political reasons in the old countries in Europe, where simply disagreeing with the government on an issue could be construed as treason. They wrote it narrowly and required witnesses to make sure it couldn't be used as a tool to bludgeon your political opponents to death with. And unfortunately, that's where the Democrats seem content to take us back to those days. And the most ironic thing about this is that is such an authoritarian tactic to turn around and accuse all your political opponents of treason. But then we are to believe that the so-called resistance are the ones fighting for liberty and freedom when they're accusing everybody who disagrees with them of treason.
Yeah, and also the quote unquote resistance are the ones going on public places, literally screaming at innocent bystanders for just wearing MAGA hats and assaulting people. Which is something that Adam and I talked about last week. So,
And keep in mind that Trump literally walked back his comments from Helsinki the very next day, and there are still cries that he committed treason with what he said at Helsinki. I mean, it wasn't exactly like he said this with deeply held convictions and has repeated it since Helsinki. He's not repeated any of those statements since, and I haven't heard anybody say, "Oh, it's not treason."
I will sort of be fair to them and kind of disagree with Gabe on this point, because I think there's that old saying, "Actions speak louder than words." And Trump has, and this is part of why I like Trump so much, is he has consistently, even though he walks back and issues these little I forget the term that I used to use all the time for this, but these these moral signals. There's a term for it. Maybe Sam, you can remind me. Virtue signaling. Virtue signaling. He issues this little virtue signaling statement in order to appease largely some of the elite within his own party. But then, we know that, and then right after that, he invited Putin to come to D.C. So he consistently goes back and shows he does want to have friendly relations with Russia. But then he'll turn around and give these statements which aren't too believable. And that's not saying that I think he committed treason, because I don't think it is. I think I've established that. But to be sort of fair to them, he is consistently, in terms of actions, if not words, more in favor of friendly relations with Russia.
Well, and as
he comes back to it over and over again. He comes back to the attitude that contradicts the statements that his advisors or establishment Republicans have requested he make.
And as I've discussed numerous times on here and on my own podcast and in my columns, when Trump walks back his statements or something like that with kind of a wink and a nod, right? What you're seeing is Trump the businessman and Trump the entertainer coming out in full force. The reason why Trump was so successful in business and in media was because he understood how to play a crowd and tell people what they wanted to hear, while also promoting his own agenda. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's performing treasonous actions either. But what I'm saying is I think he was distracting the media by walking it back. While in the meantime he's, meeting with Putin and inviting him to DC, and basically he's misdirection is the term. He's misdirecting the media and kind of sending them off on their own wild goose chase. And I'm not one to usually subscribe to the 4D chess, theory of Trump. But in this case, I certainly do think we are seeing his business and media skills, his savvy come into play here. So
I think it is. Because if you have to understand that a majority, for now anyway, because a lot of them are retiring, but a majority of the Republicans has to work with in the Senate and the House, particularly those in leadership like Paul Ryan. I know he came out and gave a scathing statement after the Helsinki summit at first. But the people he's got to work with, at least for now, are all against his more, what would seem to be his more deeply held position. And so it's just a matter of office politics, if you will, because you do have to maintain somewhat of good relations. So a little appeasement a little empty statement of appeasement here or there just will help him out for a little bit longer in terms of his relations with his own party. I would note also, though, that what he said at Helsinki, he said he agreed at the actual conference, he agreed with Putin. And while we're discussing words, I think it's important to actually look at what Putin said, because Putin's exact words on this were that Russia as a state did not hack or interfere with the election in any way. And what does that mean, though? He's simply saying that the Russian government did not get involved in any of this stuff. I didn't do it. I didn't order it. I didn't have anything to do with what might have happened. Now, it may have been independent hackers who happen to be Russian and who happen to be living in and operating out of Russia, but they're not government hackers. And that's, if you remember back, I think that was the very first article I ever wrote for American Watchmen. I offered that up as an immediate possibility, saying it's very likely that this is just a group of independent hackers in Eastern Europe or somewhere in Russia, and that has nothing to do with the Russian government. And the interesting thing on this is that our intelligence services have not released, as you noted, Sam, any of the so-called evidence they have that the Russian government did this. So who's to say that the intel actually doesn't show that Putin is right? I mean, it's just wild to me, the lengths that our elites have gone to vilify Russia, and they've pushed this almost like a horse with blinders on, this very singular narrative where they've ruled out every other possibility in favor of the one that coincidentally most aligns with their own interests and biases.
Well,
I was going to say, to back up Josh's point, how isn't it interesting that they indict in a document a day before Trump has his summit with Putin, 12 Russians who they can't name, but that they know worked for the Kremlin. But again, they don't release any evidence, because the document that they did release detailing the 12 Russians who supposedly did the hacking, that doesn't document the evidence. All that says is simply these 12 Russians we know hacked our elections. It doesn't detail what they hacked or how they influenced the election, whether they impacted any votes. Simply, they did it.
And
I would also add to Gabe's point, on the way back immediately after from the summit too, they arrested the, I believe she's 29 or 30 years old, the Maria Butina, the alleged Russian spy I mentioned at the beginning of this. And she doesn't, I think she's honestly innocent. I think she's just some young girl who is being used as a scapegoat in order to try and drive a wedge between Trump and Putin immediately after the summit. Because if you look at her background, she was a student who came here on a student visa. She's a pro-Second Amendment, I might not use that term because she's from Russia, but a pro-gun rights activist. She was deeply involved with the NRA and the National Prayer Breakfast, and we're told that she's some sort of high-level Russian spy. Well, let me ask you, who is she stealing state secrets from at the frickin' NRA? Does the NRA have the nuclear codes, or does John Hagee at the National Prayer Breakfast have some sort of CIA intel? I mean, they charged her with trying to infiltrate American politics. But if that's the case, then we're all guilty, because if you've been involved in the political system, you have, by definition, infiltrated it. So I don't see how she's a spy, and I think it's coincidental. The timing of her arrest is it reeks to high heaven to me.
You say that, Josh, but again, this goes back to Trump derangement syndrome. You may say, well, we're all guilty of treason. You kind of say that jokingly, but that's literally how the Trump derangement syndrome people think. There are people out there who probably think that you and I and Adam and Gabe literally are Russian spies on the payroll of the FSB or someone like that, because that is how bad Trump derangement syndrome has gotten.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I forgot what I was going to. I was going to bring up another point in relation, but I can't remember what it is right now. So, Gabe, go ahead.
I will say it's also a reflection of just how much power our intelligence agencies wield, that you can't question them in any way, shape, or form. You can't question their conclusions. You can't question what they find. And I hesitate to even use the word question, because how this entire situation is played out, where Trump questioned it and the word treason is thrown around so casually. I mean, the intelligence agencies now are basically a sacred cow. You can't question their conclusions. You can't. It's just striking to me how much this situation really shows how much power unelected officials in our intelligence apparatus have. I mean, it really does kind of speak to, if you were one of those people, to a conspiracy theory.
I would add to Gabe's point, because I've made this comparison or this joke half seriously, if you will. We always talk about in psychology about projecting. If I'm lazy, then I constantly call you lazy. Well, what if people like John McCain and John Brennan and the top level military industrial complex intelligence service people, what do they always say about Russia? It's an intelligence dictatorship. The KGB took over the entire government, and that's what it is. Well, aren't we doing the same thing here when we have so many people from the CIA or the FBI who wield so much power in our political system, and then immediately, even after they leave their bureaucratic offices that they're completely unelected to, they turn around and immediately try and all become congressmen like Michael Mullen or like John McCain?
And as I've said numerous times before, I said this at the beginning of the podcast, I believe that there are many good individuals in the intelligence community, both former and active, but there are a lot of bureaucrats there too. Curiously enough, I won't go into names of people who I know who are pro MAGA people who are former CIA, but long story short, there are some, and they've all told me that for years there have been people within the CIA and the FBI who don't belong there in their opinion, because they're undermining the very goal of national security, and they're propping up their own national interests instead.
I know there was I forget the name of the book, but he was the CIA agent who was either part of the team that was tasked with interrogating Saddam Hussein, or he was the actual guy who interrogated Saddam Hussein. But he wrote a book afterwards, and a lot of the stuff that Saddam told them in custody, which by this point he had no reason to lie. He knew he was a dead man. His own attorney told him that you're basically going to die in a show trial so that they can justify the war, since they didn't find the WMDs. But Saddam warned the United States government over and over again, here's the things you shouldn't do in Iraq, and we ignored all of his advice almost. But the people who interrogated him, who wrote the guy particularly who wrote this book, and I'll maybe send you a link afterwards in our chat because I can't remember the title of it. But he basically said that when he was at the CIA during the Bush years, the agents at the top, the people he was sending these reports of these interrogations back to, were incredibly interested in ignoring what Saddam's actual advice was or what was being told, in favor of presenting to the White House things that aligned with the White House's own political agenda, telling them things they wanted to hear. And it's sort of interesting now, because now it seems like, because the White House is now inhabited by an outsider who truly is foreign to the elite that have typically run our country, they're more interested in promoting that same worldview as opposed to even trying to tailor things to what Trump might want. So it's interesting to see how the dynamics have shifted now that an outsider is in the White House.
And also, I remember what I was going to say now in regards to the CIA. And also, it's interesting that Trump is supposedly anti-intelligence now, because after the election, within like the first 6 weeks of his presidency, Trump actually had a visit at the NTCT, which, for those of you who don't know, that's the National Counterterrorism Center, which is separate from the CIA and the FBI. But he basically went there and gave a quick little press tour and said, you guys are doing great work, and I am in full support of you. One thing that I can speak to is it's interesting, because I believe that the CIA and the intelligence community is deeply split right now. There's Trump's intelligence community, and then there's the deep state community. Trump's intelligence agency, Trump's side of the intelligence community, from what I've gathered, has been more focused on investigating both domestic and international child trafficking rings. and which has there hasn't been a lot of publicity on that lately, but supposedly Trump's administration has already busted several thousand of these rings. But the reason why I bring that up is that is an example of the intelligence communities, both domestic and abroad, doing what they should be doing. We should be punishing child traffickers with them to the fullest extent, whether that be in court or covertly. With that being said, there's also this whole deep state attachment within the intelligence communities, which are trying to undermine and destroy Trump. And I think it was Adam who said the other day in our private chat that Kennedy wanted to get rid of the intelligence, that he wanted to get rid of the CIA at one point.
Well, and I'll add to your point, Sam, and say I actually think there's a third group within the CIA, and I think it's the group that has largely pushed the Russian investigation, and that is political appointees.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I guess when I think of the deep state, I think more of the rank and file average CIA FBI member who has certain biases that make them more likely to take an action that has a political consequence. I don't know if that's necessarily their driving influence, but I think it plays a part. Then I think we have the average rank and file. And then I think there's a third category, and they're relatively small, but they are the ones who wield the power, and they are the political appointees who drive the agenda. And I think the most prominent example for me would be John Brennan, who kind of actually got the whole Russian ball rolling because he played politics while he was still head of the CIA.
I would note, just bouncing off both Gabe and Sam's points, as Gabe mentioned earlier, they're treated as a sacred cow at this point. And as Sam mentioned, either they were tolerating these child, and I have seen this, I've not studied it too much, but I can say I've seen stories of how many they're cracking down on. I just saw, I think Robert De Niro, the actor, was involved in one of those child sex trafficking rings just earlier today or yesterday. I saw that story. But either they were tolerating it and allowing it to happen, or they're actively involved in it. And I would say that's the notion that these intelligence agencies are incorruptible just doesn't jive with history, because it's common knowledge that during the 1950s, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI allowed organized crime and the mob to run rampant through Vegas and the country in general, and they just didn't do anything at all to punish or even go after these people while Hoover was in charge of the FBI. So,
yeah.
I mean, these are the notion that these are all the disciples of Jesus working at these intelligence agencies is just incredibly naive.
Did we lose Adam? I'm not seeing.
I'm still here.
Okay. I didn't. I saw you turned your camera off, so I wasn't sure if that meant that you broke up or anything like that. We've had glitches here, so I just wanted to make sure that the NSA or something didn't shut you down. So
no, the NSA or the Navy didn't shut me down.
I would like to hear Adam sort of elaborate a little bit on the JFK angle, since you brought it up, though, because I thought that was interesting the other day.
Oh, yeah. So about a week or two ago, I was kind of doing some research on some stuff, and I was looking at the whole Russia thing and the whole how the CIA and Trump's believing Russia over the CIA and all that, and Trump doesn't trust the CIA or any of the intelligence agencies, and came back to there is an off-mic quote that someone caught from JFK, who actually said he wanted to splinter up the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the wind.
I don't know if you guys were all in on this podcast with Sam and I, but I know Sam definitely remembers it. But do you remember, Sam, when I ranted about foreign policy and the military-industrial complex on that one show of yours? And I focused intensely on how outgoing President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned about the rising military-industrial complex, deep state, in his outgoing address as president, and then how American foreign policy just went completely downhill after that.
Josh, I think that's like my number 2 or 3 ranked episode in terms of.
Was that just you and me, or were the rest of the guys with us on that too? I can't remember.
No, that was just you and I. That was at the very beginning of we had just that was our first Christmas when we had American Watchmen. So but yeah, that was like December something of 2016. So
and that's why I thought that was interesting that Adam had mentioned that, because that just perfectly fit into the timeline as I had observed it. And I would encourage everybody who's listening to this, even our fellow podcast hosts, look up Dwight D. Eisenhower's final address, his outgoing address as president. Watch it. It's pretty scary when he talks about the growing political clout of the intelligence services and the arms industry at that time.
Yeah, well, I mean, and not, geez, I'm starting to sound more and more like an Alex Jones conspiracy, type these days. Although, I try to stay away from, the frog, the gay frog conspiracies and aliens. I'm not that far out there. But I will say that one of the interesting theories I have heard regarding the intelligence agencies and the mafia, going back to what Josh was saying about about Hoover allowing the mafia to run rampant. I've heard that one of the reasons why the Bay of Pigs took place was because the mafia at the time, back in the 50s and back in the 40s and 50s, before Castro took over, Cuba was basically a mafia hotbed where they were able to, they basically owned several casinos and had businesses.
They did
in Cuba.
In Havana, Cuba, it was Meyer Lansky, who was the big one, but he was actually estimated to be more powerful than Fulgencio Batista, the Cuban president at the time, and he was incredibly corrupt. He actually it's now in the Museum of the Revolution in Havana, but he had a solid gold telephone from AT&T. So American corporations and the mob were able to using the word rape again, they really did just rape Cuba for its resources and treat it however they wanted for their benefit. And you are correct about the mob and the Bay of Pigs, but not just the Bay of Pigs. The mafia was intimately involved with the initial attempts to try and assassinate Castro. Then Vice President Richard Nixon actually was deeply involved with working with the mob to try and arrange the hits on Castro, and that later played into Watergate because Nixon was incredibly afraid that some of his connections to the mob might be, for reasons of national security, might be misconstrued again as personal corruption on his part after the Checkers speech he had to give when he was first running for vice president. So after that first speech he had to give in 1952, when he was accused of having a slush fund made up of the money from donors that he was abusing for his own self, which he proved himself innocent of. After that, he was intensely afraid of being accused of being corrupt or crooked again, and he was afraid that because he had worked so closely with the mob in terms of trying to get Castro killed with the CIA, he was afraid that would get out again, and so that tied into Watergate. I have a full book on it. It's about the size of the Bible, and it's a great book. I forget the name of it off the top of my head. I can go grab it in a few minutes. But
yeah, I have a novel in my bookshelf, which you can see the bookshelf back behind me, but you can't see the book. It's a historical fiction novel, but it's based on a fact. It's called American Tabloid, and it's basically about how the mafia and the political class originally worked to help get Jack Kennedy elected in 1960, and then wound up ironically taking him down in 63 after the after the Bay of Pigs went wrong. Basically,
it wasn't just the Bay of Pigs either. At the time, Hoover would remain as head of the FBI until, I believe, 1973 when he died, or 1972
Yeah.
when he was president. But even though he was head of the FBI, Kennedy had his brother Jack as Attorney General really start cracking down hard on the mob. Bobby, sorry, my bad.
Yeah.
Had Bobby start cracking down on the mob as Attorney General, which didn't sit too well, as you can imagine, with Hoover and his buddies in the mafia, or the mafia themselves.
No, it did not. So, but well, we could talk about Kennedy conspiracies and whatnot all day, because that's one of my favorite topics. But we are coming up on the end of the hour. I think we're a little bit past.
I like how we veered off completely from Russia. Gabe's just been silent the whole. He warned this would happen, but.
And so, well,
I think it kind of tangentially, or if I'm saying that word right, applies, just because I think it kind of highlights the power of intelligence agencies, and just kind of how the federal bureaucratic apparatus has began to gain so much power even back then.
Yeah. But in conclusion, I mean, I personally don't think that this, that this summit will have any effect on Trump, Trump's presidency negatively. I think, it might actually have the opposite. I think it might actually be positive for Trump. Gentlemen, any final thoughts on Helsinki?
I just look forward to America and Russia hopefully having a fresh start and working over. Everybody knows, who listens to this program anyway, how adamantly pro-Russia I am in my views. But I think if this plays out in the way that I would like to see it play out, I think we're going to see a paradigm shift of sorts, and I think we've seen that already with Trump across this whole European trip. I think Rand Paul phrased it the best. We need to reassess who our allies are, because it isn't the Cold War anymore, and the geopolitical situation has changed drastically. There was some encouraging news from the CIA just this morning, where they finally admitted that maybe this is due to Trump's influence with that pro-Trump wing, or not pro-Trump wing, but the professional wing of the intelligence services that actually do just want to do their jobs and keep the country safe, came out and basically said China is trying to replace us as a global superpower, and they are our number one threat. And if you're going to stop China, here's the ruck of it, really. If you want to go ahead and keep pushing Russia further and further away, well, congratulations, you'll have aligned two superpowers against the United States. Or you could play it smart, as Nixon would have done, or Kissinger, and you can get Russia, at least, if not, you can align Russia with us and Eastern Europe against the growing Chinese threat, which does pose strategic threats to both of us. For us, it's the South China Sea and trade. For Russia, they are particularly concerned about the regions of East Siberia, which China is increasingly aggressive in their tone about, because they view it as part of their territory and not Russia's.
Interesting. Well, that might be a topic for next week, because Josh, I think you're the one hosting the roundtable next week. So
I think I'll find something else for us. Now, I love talking about foreign policy in Russia, but if we do another episode on Russia at this point, then we might as well just rename the podcast the Russia Cast or something, because in such a short period of time, we've dedicated more hours talking about this subject on this show so far than we have anything else. So I'd love to do that next week, but I think I'm going to try and find something to even it out.
Yeah, otherwise we'll have to play the Russian national anthem at the beginning of these things. Otherwise, so, but anyway, Adam, any final thoughts from you?
None here. No.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I guess that will do it for this week's podcast. And again, go to AmericanWatchman.org. Although our domain is down right now, but we will have that again shortly. But again, thank you for listening, and be sure to visit AmericanWatchmen.org once that's back up, and please leave us a rating and a review on iTunes, and we'll be back next week for another episode of the Roundtable. Good night, God bless, and God save this great nation.
Indeed.